She was standing on the steps of the Redrock land office when Silas Cutter read her dead husband's name aloud, and every man in that crowd turned to look at her like she was something that had just been priced. She had never met the man she came west to marry. She had only met his debt. The note was real. $240, signed in a hand she did not recognize, dated 3 weeks before she arrived. The man who signed it had been dead 11 days by the time her stage reached Redrock. Dead and owing, and the debt had transferred the way debts did out here, to whoever stood closest when the ledger came due. Cutter folded the note with the patience of a man who had done this before. She had not come to Redrock to be sold, but the debt had arrived before she did, and it had her name on it, and what happened in the next 3 minutes would determine whether she left that town on her own feet or on someone else's terms. The crowd was not large, but it was loud in the way crowds go loud when they have decided not to intervene. That particular noise, half murmur and half silence, meant everyone in that street had already chosen a position, and none of them had chosen hers. Silas Cutter stood on the top step of the land office with the debt note held between 2 fingers like it was a thing of no consequence, which it was to him, because the consequence was hers. He was a compact man in a black vest with a silver watch chain, the kind of man who kept his clothes clean in a town full of dust and seemed proud of the fact. His hair was dark and heavily pomaded. He held himself with the absolute stillness of someone who had learned that movement costs authority, and he had been spending that lesson carefully for a long time. He read the amount again for the crowd. $240. He read the name on the note. Her late husband's name, not hers, though the implication was the same. He said that the debt was legal and documented, and that the territory's creditor statutes were clear on the matter of spousal obligation, which was not entirely true, but nobody in that crowd was a lawyer, and Cutter spoke with the confidence of a man who understood that most people would rather believe a lie delivered with certainty than a truth that required argument. She stood on the steps and kept her chin level and let him finish. She had been on that stage for 9 days. She had eaten hard biscuit and drunk water from a canvas bladder, and she had read the letter from her intended so many times that she had stopped reading it and started simply holding it, the way you hold something when the words have stopped being the point. The letter had described a house with a south-facing window and a garden plot and a town that needed people willing to work. It had described a future with the careful, impersonal optimism of a man writing to a stranger and hoping she would be enough. He had died before she arrived. The house existed. The south-facing window existed. The garden plot was weeds and dry ground, and the debt that bore his name had apparently outlasted everything else he ever owned. At the back of the crowd, a man had not moved since she first noticed him. He was tall, with a trail duster pushed back off his shoulders and a hat that sat low on his forehead, and he was watching Cutter with the particular stillness of someone making a calculation rather than a decision. His eyes were dark green, and they did not blink with the ordinary frequency of eyes that were simply watching something. They were the eyes of a man looking at something he already understood. She watched him the way you watch something you cannot explain. The man at the back of the crowd had not bid. He had not spoken. He had only watched, and that was the part she would not be able to explain later. Cutter called for offers. 2 men raised their hands. One owned the feed store on the north end of town. One was younger, with a prosperous look that sat uneasily on him, like a coat borrowed from someone larger. Both kept their eyes on Cutter rather than on her, which told her everything about what this was and what she was not. Then the man at the back stepped forward. He moved through the crowd the way water moves through a gap in a fence, without asking, without hurrying. He named a figure $40 above the feed store man's bid, and he said it in a voice that carried no particular feeling, as though he were quoting a price for grain. Cutter's jaw tightened by a fraction. He could not legally refuse a higher bid. He had built this entire transaction on the scaffolding of the law, and the law now required him to accept. The man paid in coin, counted out on the land office step in front of 30 witnesses, methodically, without theatre. When he was done, he pushed the stack across with 2 fingers. Cutter took the money slowly, the way a man takes something he has not lost yet in his own accounting. The man turned and handed her the debt note. Then he tore it in half. The sound of that paper tearing was the loudest thing she had heard in weeks. If you have made it this far into Cora's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Cutter stepped forward. He said that the document was discharged, but the obligation was not. He said there was a second instrument. He said the note was only one piece of what her husband had left behind. He reached into his coat and touched something there, just the edge of a folded document, just the corner visible, enough to make it present in the room. The crowd went quiet in a different way than before. The man looked at Cutter for a moment. He said 4 words. He said, "Show it or leave." Cutter smiled with the lower half of his face and said the document would be presented at the proper time and the proper place, and that patience was a virtue the law did not require him to rush. He descended the steps. His 2 men followed. The crowd parted for them, the way crowds part for men they are afraid of, not with hostility, but with the particular cooperative silence of people who have decided another person's danger is not their concern. She stood on the step with 2 halves of a debt note in her hands, and a stranger beside her who had spent a significant sum and said almost nothing, and she did not know which thing unsettled her more. The second document, or the look that had crossed the stranger's face when Cutter mentioned it. He had gone pale, just for a moment, just enough. She did not know his surname yet. What she did not understand, and would not understand until later, was that Cutter's second document had nothing to do with the debt. It had everything to do with the stranger, and a name he had not used in 3 years. Vera's saloon occupied the only building on the south side of Redrock's main street that Cutter did not own a stake in. That fact had less to do with Vera's legal acumen than with the circumstance that the deed was in her late mother's name. Her late mother had died in a different county, and the paperwork had never been worth Cutter's time to untangle. Vera set 2 cups on the table without being asked. She looked at the man the way women look at men they have a history of deciding about. She looked at Cora the way women look at women who have just been through something and are still standing. She said nothing, which meant she knew something, and Cora filed that away. The man sat with his hat on, and his hands flat on the table, and his back to the wall, and he watched the door. He had not removed his coat. He had not introduced himself. He had not asked her name, and that was the thing she kept returning to, because men who do things for women generally want something named in return, and he had asked for nothing. She said, "Why?" He said, "Why what?" She said, "You know what." He was quiet for a moment, checking his answer for accuracy before he gave it. Then he said, "Cutter has been running that particular scheme since before I came through. I do not like the scheme." She said, "That is $240 worth of not liking a scheme." He said, "I am aware." She said, "You have seen him do this before." He said, "I have heard of it. Different town, different note, same vest." She looked at the door. She said, "The second document." He said, "I know what it is." He said nothing further, and she had the clear sense that what he knew and what he was willing to say were 2 different territories with a significant distance between them. Vera came back with bread. She said his name, just the one name, and the way she said it had a question in it. He shook his head by a fraction. Cora ate the bread because she had not eaten since before dawn, and her body had requirements that did not pause for mystery. She ate, and she watched him, and he watched the door, and neither of them said anything else for a time, and the silence had the quality of two people deciding whether trust is survivable, without either one having decided yet. The ranch sat 2 miles east of town on a dry creek bed that held water 3 months out of 12. It was not his ranch. He was leasing it month to month from a man named Orchard, who had gone to Tucson and not come back. He said she could have the back room. She said, "For how long?" He said, "Until you have somewhere else to go." She said, "That is not an answer." He said, "It is the only one I have." The back room had a cot, a window that latched, and a hook on the inside of the door. She checked all 3 that first night, with the methodical care of a woman who has learned that security is a thing you verify rather than assume. She slept, which surprised her. In the morning she was up before him. She found the kitchen and the cold stove and the tin box of coffee and made a fire and put water on, and when he came in, she had a cup waiting, and that was the beginning of a negotiation they never explicitly named. She worked because there was always work on a ranch, even a small one, even a borrowed one, and work was the one language she had trusted since she was old enough to understand that the world did not give things freely. She mended fence. She mucked the 2 stalls and spread fresh straw. She found where the water barrel leaked at the bottom seam and packed the gap with clay from the creek bed and let it cure in the sun for 2 days, and it held. She found a broken hinge on the barn door and replaced it with iron strap from the junk pile at the back of the barn. She did not do these things to repay him or to perform usefulness. She did them because work was solid and the rest of her situation was not, and she needed one solid thing to stand on while she thought through what remained. On the second afternoon, she found the garden plot behind the house. It was smaller than the one in the letter, and drier, and nothing had been planted in it in what looked like 2 growing seasons. She stood at the edge of it for a while, with the smell of dry ground around her, and the particular ache of a thing that had been promised and had not arrived. She had crossed the country for this, not for the garden plot specifically, but for the idea it represented, the idea that a place could be made to yield something if you were willing to put your hands into it. She had left a life that was too small behind her and come west for a larger one, and what she had found instead was a dead man's debt and a stranger's borrowed ranch and a town that had watched her humiliation on a set of steps and gone quietly back to its business. She was not sorry she had come. She had made the decision with what she had known at the time, and she did not have the habit of punishing herself for decisions made in good faith. But she stood at the edge of that dry plot for a long time before she went back inside. He rode out each morning and came back before dark, and did not tell her where he went, and she did not ask. He was not a man who offered information, and she was not at a point in her life where she had the luxury of demanding it. On the 3rd evening, he came back later than usual, when the dark had already settled and the first stars were out. He unsaddled in silence and came in and washed and sat down, and she put food in front of him, and they ate in the way they had developed, which was not quite companionable and not quite uncomfortable, but something that existed between those 2 things. He said, "There is a man in town asking questions." She said, "About what?" He said, "About who bought your note, about where you are staying, about whether you have family coming." She said, "I do not have family coming." He said, "I know. I told him that." She looked at him. He said, "He works for Cutter." 2 steps removed. The kind of arrangement that gives Cutter something to point to when he wants distance from a thing. She said, "What does Cutter want to know?" He said, "How much time he has." Neither of them said anything after that for a while. The lamp burned between them, and the night outside was very still, and somewhere out on the range a coyote called once and did not call again. The ranch had one problem she had not noticed until the 3rd morning. It had only one entrance, a single track in from the main road, visible for a 1/4 mile in either direction. Anyone coming could be seen from the yard. Anyone leaving could be seen from the road. She turned that over in her mind for several days, without deciding whether it was protection or a trap. He had been in Redrock for 11 days. She knew this from Vera, who conducted most of her knowledge at a volume that suggested she did not always distinguish between things that were hers to share and things that were not. He had planned to leave after 3 days. He had stayed because of the auction, because of Cutter. She believed that. She also believed it was not the whole answer. On the 4th day, she found the letter in the barn. It was tucked under a loose board in the corner of the feed bin, not hidden carefully. Hidden the way something is hidden by a person not entirely certain they want it to stay hidden. The envelope was addressed to a name she did not recognize. The surname matched the one she thought she had heard Vera use. The given name was different. The letter was from a marshal named Harker, out of Cimarron County. It was formal and brief. It said the warrant remained active. It said the named party was advised to present himself at the nearest authorized office at his earliest opportunity. She read it once. She folded it back exactly as she had found it. She replaced it under the board. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked out at the dry creek bed for a long time. On the 5th day, Cutter came to the ranch. He did not come alone. He brought the same 2 men from the auction. They arrived in the late afternoon, when the light was flat and orange, and Flint was still out on the range. Cora was at the fence by the barn when she heard the horses on the track. She did not run inside. Running inside was what people did when they were afraid, and she had decided on the 3rd morning that whatever else she was going to be in Redrock, she was not going to be afraid in the open air, where it could be read on her face. Cutter dismounted with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything. He said good afternoon. He said he hoped she was comfortable. He said he hoped the man she was staying with had explained the situation clearly, because men of that particular type were not always forthcoming about the full picture. She said, "What situation?" He reached into his coat and produced the second document. He unfolded it on the top rail of the fence and smoothed it flat with one hand. It was a deed of claim. The property named on the deed was this ranch, the orchard lease, and the signatory was her late husband. The date was 8 months prior. The deed claimed an outstanding lien on the property for a debt incurred in a card game, with the land held as collateral, transferable upon the signatory's death to the note holder. Cutter. She looked at the number in the upper right corner. 4 digits, a dash, 2 letters. She looked at the date. She looked at the handwriting. She said, "My husband was never in Redrock." Cutter said, "Records can be surprising." She said the document number to herself twice, silently, and stored it in the part of her mind she used for things she could not afford to forget. She said, "What do you want?" Cutter said he wanted the ranch cleared by end of the week. He said this was not a personal matter, only a legal one. The quick-eyed man moved sideways toward her. The thick one drifted toward the barn door. Cora held still in the way a person holds still when they are not afraid, but are thinking rapidly in a situation that does not reward visible thinking. The quick-eyed man took hold of her arm above the elbow, not roughly, deliberately, the way you take hold of something, to make a point about your ability to take hold of it. She looked at Cutter, and not at the man holding her arm. She said, "He can let go now." Cutter looked at her for a moment. He nodded once. The man let go. Cutter folded the deed back into his coat and said he would expect her answer by Thursday. He mounted and rode out with his men behind him, and the dust from their horses drifted east in the flat light, and she stood in the yard until it had settled completely. Then she went inside, sat at the table, opened the small book of verse her mother had given her at the stage, and wrote the document number on the inside cover. She pressed the pencil hard enough that the impression would survive anything short of the page being destroyed. When he rode back, she had food on the stove. He came in and looked at her once, and she understood he had already read most of what had happened in the angle she was standing at. He washed and sat, and she put food in front of him and sat across from him and told him everything in order, calmly, the way you recount something to someone who needs information rather than feeling. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The document number," she told him. Something shifted behind his eyes. He said, "That number is from the Cimarron County Deed Registry." She said, "Not Redrock." He said, "Not Redrock," which means it is forged or transferred from a Cimarron filing. Either way, there is an original record that predates it. She said, "You have seen documents like this before." He said, "Once, 3 years ago." She looked at him across the table. She said, "The letter in the barn is from a marshal named Harker out of Cimarron County." He did not look surprised. He looked like a man watching a door open that he has been standing in front of for a long time. He said, "You read it." She said, "I read it." He was quiet. The lamp between them burned at a low, steady height, and outside was the particular dark of open country, with no town lights near enough to soften it. He said, "The charge in that letter is for a killing I did not commit. The man I would have proved it against was the county recorder for Cimarron. He had the kind of friends that make a man difficult to argue with in court, and I had nobody willing to stand beside me and say what they knew, so I ran. 3 years ago. I have been keeping a careful distance from my own name ever since." She said, "And Cutter knows who you are." He said, "Cutter knows. That is what the second document is. It is not about this ranch. The ranch is the lever. What he wants is for me to leave Redrock without trouble, because I am the only person in this part of the territory who has seen him run this operation before and knows enough about his methods to challenge them." She said, "Because you were there the first time." He said, "I was in the county when he ran the same scheme in a town called Belen. Different note, different woman, different land, same structure. I know what the forged deed looks like, and I know where the original registry would have to exist to contradict it." She said, "So you have one option. Go to the land office, find the original deed record, and file a challenge. But to file, you have to put your name in the record." He said, "Full name, county of origin. It becomes public. Harker sees it within the week." She said, "And then?" He said, "And then I stop running, one direction or another." The lamp burned steady. Outside, the wind had come up, and she could hear it moving through the dry grass along the creek bed. She said, "I will stand with you." He looked at her then in a way he had not looked at her before, directly, without the careful management he usually brought to his own face, as though he had set something down. He did not answer for a long time. He said, "The county recorder in Cimarron died last winter. That is the only reason I have been able to stay anywhere longer than 2 weeks. His death quieted something. Not completely, but enough that the urgency dropped." She said, "And Cutter found you anyway." He said, "Cutter was looking. He ran the same scheme in Belen 3 years ago, and I was the one who understood what he was doing. He has been waiting for me to resurface in a place where he could use what he knows." She said, "And now he has." He said, "And now he has. Which means I have one option." She said, "I will stand with you." He looked at her for a long time then, the way he had not looked before. Then he said, "All right." He had one option left, and he had known it from the moment she told him the document number. It was the option he had been riding away from for 3 years, and he was going to take it now. And the only thing different from every other time he had faced it was that someone was going to be standing beside him. They rode into Redrock the following morning, before the town was properly awake. He went to the land office and woke the clerk and asked for the original deed registry for the orchard lease. The clerk produced a bound ledger. He found the page. The original deed was there, dated 4 years ago, free and clear. No liens, no notes, no encumbrances of any kind. The registry number was a Redrock number. Cutter's document was a forgery. He asked the clerk to witness and certify a copy. The clerk, who had been watching Cutter conduct business in this town for 2 years, with the discomfort of someone who knows something is wrong but cannot find the right moment to say so, pressed the stamp without requiring additional reasons. Cutter had called a town meeting for Thursday afternoon in the saloon before the town council and the sheriff. He had scheduled it publicly and in advance because public process was his armor. A thing witnessed by a full town was a thing that required a full town to undo, and most towns did not have the appetite for it. He had not calculated for a man who had nothing left to protect to walk through that door. The saloon filled by 2 in the afternoon. Cutter was at the front with his men and a council member and the sheriff, who had the expression of someone who already suspected he was going to regret this afternoon. He came in from the back and stood near the door. Cutter looked at him. His stillness deepened in a way that was its own tell. Cutter began. He produced the forged deed and started reading. He said, "Before you finish that." The room turned. He said his full name. He said his county of origin. He said both clearly, in a voice that carried without being raised, and he watched the room understand what it cost him to say those words in public, because Redrock was a town full of people who understood the value of a name that had been kept quiet. He said, "The document Silas Cutter is holding was forged using a registry number from Cimarron County. The original deed for the orchard lease is in the Redrock land office, recorded 4 years ago, clear of all encumbrances." He held up the certified copy. He said, "I would invite anyone who wants to verify the registry numbers to walk to the land office now and do so." Cutter said, "That document has been filed and witnessed before a legal officer." He said, "Witnessed under a registry number that does not govern this county. You can verify that as well." The council members said that perhaps the sheriff ought to examine both instruments before proceeding. The sheriff looked relieved to have been given something specific to do. Cutter's quick-eyed man stepped toward Cora, who was standing to his left with the certified copy in her hands. The man reached for it. She held on. She had been holding on to things for a long time. She was good at it. He stepped sideways, simply into the space between the man's arm and her shoulder, and stood there. The man looked up at him. The man thought about something and stepped back. The sheriff returned from the land office in 11 minutes. He said the registry numbers did not correspond. He said the orchard deed was original and predated Cutter's instrument by 4 years. He looked at Cutter with the full weight of a man who has been waiting for a sufficient reason. He said, "Silas, I think you need to come with me." Cutter looked at the room. The room did not move for him. He went. His 2 men drifted out without instruction. The saloon let out a breath. Vera, from behind the bar, said, "Well," and poured 2 glasses and did not charge for them. Marshal Harker rode into Redrock on Saturday morning, 2 days after the town meeting. He was in the yard splitting wood when Harker came up the track, visible from a 1/4 mile out. He stood with his hands at his sides and did not move toward the barn or the house. He waited. Harker dismounted with the economy of a man whose back had opinions about long rides. He looked at him for a moment, then at the ranch, then at Cora in the doorway, then back. He said, "You filed your name at the land office." He said, "I did." Harker said, "You knew I would come." He said, "I knew." Harker pulled off his gloves and was quiet for a moment, looking at the ground the way men look at ground when they are choosing their words. He said, "The county recorder in Cimarron died last winter." His successor went through the office files as a matter of routine and found some instruments in the old record that did not hold up to scrutiny. Several cases from 3 years prior were flagged. Yours was among them. He paused. He said, "The charge is under formal review. I am not here to serve the warrant today. I am here because you put your name into a public record, and I had an obligation to follow it, and because I wanted to see for myself what kind of man does that when he does not have to. He said, "You could have run. You had time after the town meeting." He said, "I know." Harker put his gloves back on. He said, "I will be in contact through the Redrock Post when the review reaches its conclusion." He nodded once to Cora in the doorway, with the courtesy of a man who knows more than he is saying. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the road. They stood in the yard listening until the sound of the horse had gone entirely, until there was only the wind off the range and the small ordinary sounds of the ranch settling into a morning that had no particular threat in it. She came out and stood beside him, not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be present. The range spread out in front of them in the morning light, wide and flat and indifferent the way open country is indifferent, which is to say it did not care what happened to them, but it was there either way, and it was large enough that two people could stand inside it and feel like they might fit. Neither of them said anything. The axe was still on the ground. After a while he picked it up and went back to the wood, and she went inside, and the sounds of the morning resumed around them in the ordinary way of mornings that have been gotten through. If Cora's story stayed with you, we would love to know which moment you will carry longest. Was it the morning she stood in that yard while Cutter's man held her arm, and she did not flinch, and she memorized the document number instead? Or was it the moment he said his full name out loud in a room full of people, knowing what it would cost, because she had told him she would stand with him? If you know someone who has ever held on to something in the middle of a situation that told them to let go, share this story with them. It may be exactly what they need to hear. Like this video if it moved you. If you want more stories from the frontier, subscribe to this channel, and leave us a comment below, telling us what you think happened when Harker's letter finally came through, because we read every one of them. 2 sets of boot prints led from the yard toward the door of the ranch house, side by side in the soft ground near the step, and the morning light came flat and gold across the range, and the grass along the dry creek bed bent all one way in the early wind.